Hi, I'm Bronwyn Williams. We're back with a small print, and today my guest is Jon Alexander. As you were warned, Jon, on this show, we like our guests to introduce themselves the way they'd like to be introduced. So who are you? Where are you in the world? And what keeps you up at night?
My name's Jon Alexander. I am the author of a book called Citizens, Why the Key to Fixing Everything is All of Us, which is, yes, just over my shoulder for those who have video presence. I am in the UK. I am, I think probably the best way to introduce myself very briefly is to say I started my career working in the advertising industry and went on a big trip of asking deeper and deeper questions about what that's really all about, what that industry is doing in the world, and came out the other side deciding that I wanted to use my skills and tell a very different story. And that led to both founding a consulting business called the New Citizenship Project, and then ultimately to writing this book with its very unambitious subtitle. And this word citizen is something that I'm very focused on and believe could hold the key to a lot of the change we need to make in the world right now.
Fantastic. Now, before I get on to the book, which is the reason that I found you and asked you to come on the show, can you tell us a bit about the New Citizenship Project? Because what is that? Is it an NGO or a consultancy? That was the question I was unable to answer for myself.
It's a fair question, and it's basically because it is a consultancy business, but it's one with an absolutely shocking business model. Because what anyone who does consultancy will tell you is that what you need to do is formulate a single product and then sell that to as many people as possible. But that sucks because it's really boring. So what we are really is a kind of research project. We're working with organizations of all shapes and sizes to ask what it would look like if they treated people as citizens rather than as consumers, coming with all sorts of different ideas and ways of working as a result of that, and paying ourselves shockingly as a result.
Sounds good. So you love what you do, basically. Like, as I say, love what you do is a terrible career advice for young people. Go do something that you hate, as my friend Rich Mulholland says. He's a motivational speaker. And he's like, no, don't do what you love, do what you hate. And in fact, find something that you hate in the world and then change it, which is kind of what you are doing too. So you are taking his more serious advice there. And there was a problem that you saw, this problem with, as you term it in your book, which we're going to get to now, this idea of our society or people in our society today see themselves as consumers, as bodies that have rights but don't have any commiserate responsibilities. And this is kind of the story that we've been telling ourselves, whether it is in terms of our relationship with our state or the relationship with the businesses that we work and buy for. There's this idea that we are a kind of little prince kind of generation where we expect we expect other people to solve our problems, and we throw tantrums if we don't get exactly what we want. And this has not necessarily been very good for us, good for society, or good for the planet. At least that was my understanding of over summarizing your work that clearly took a lot longer than that little intro did. But maybe in your own words, what is the book Citizens about from your perspective? What's the business pitch? How did you pitch it to a publisher? What were you trying to do here?
I mean, I think you're not a long way. Like, I like the way you say it, and in many ways, the joy of this sort of work is that people see different. Would probably just add, or maybe sort of see slightly differently. Is I guess I'm more forgiving of us in that picture. Where I place the emphasis really is that the way we're surrounded by story, and humans are by nature storytelling and story dwelling creatures, and this story of us as consumers isn't something hard not. And this, going back to the thing of the way I came to see this was as storytellers. And my first boss described my job to me by saying, what you've got to remember is the average consumer sees something like 3,000 commercial messages a day. And he said, your job to cut through that. And for a while, I was happy trying to sort of cut through that, make mine the best. But then I started to think, like, what are we doing to ourselves when we ourselves with this of who we are, idea of people as consumers, 1,000+ times a day? Like, that stat actually comes from way back in 2003. So it's off lots more than that now, particularly for certain cohorts. But your question, the way the way I pitch the book, the way I think about it, the reason why it is really to try and offer a different way of seeing the moment in time we're living in. I think it's all too easy, all too much the default to see the moment in time we're living in as a time of collapse without seeing the emergence that I think is also happening. And I believe it's important to be able to see that emergence in order to be able to build the future we could, the future we need to have. So I see the world through the lens of story. I talk about 3 different stories of the individual: subject, consumer, and citizen. You can think of it as a broad historical shift. At the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, people were something like subjects. The right thing is keep your head down, do as you're told, get what you're given, on the basis that the God-given few who know best will run society and they will lead to the best outcomes. Middle of the 20th century, that story kind of collapsed. Rise of the middle class, industrial revolution, all of that stuff. Out of the 2 world wars, we more or less deliberately, more or less consciously constructed what I call the consumer story. And the logic there is that the right thing to do is to pursue self-interest, because self-interest will add up to collective interest. This is the Little Prince that you referred to so beautifully. And I believe the moment we're living in right now is, just as the subject story collapsed before, the consumer story is collapsing now. That logic that says that pursuit of self-interest will add up to collective interest just can't hold. You can't solve a crisis of loneliness and mental ill health from within a story that insists that we're independent, isolated individuals. You can't solve a crisis of inequality and inequity from within a story that life as a competition, that we should climb one another in order to raise the level for the whole. And you can't solve a climate and nature crisis from within a story that says that we're separate from nature and this is the accumulation of material possessions. You just can't do it. And so as a result, the structures that have been built out of it can't support us in this. And so we're living through collapse. But at the same time, what we're doing, and many of us are doing all over the world, is tapping into a much idea of people as citizens, which I think pre-exists the subject story, pre-exists is a deeper truth of humanity that says actually the right thing to do is to get involved, to contribute your ideas and energy and resources to the pursuit of the best outcomes for society, and critically, to my slight question of your definition, for the institutions and organizations to encourage us to do so, to redesign government and business and an idea that we need to tap into the ideas of everyone, because all of us are smarter than any of us, and that is how we'll grow society. And I see that emerging everywhere. And that's what I wrote the book for, to show that story to the world.
Yeah, you, of course, summarize it much better because you've been thinking about this for a lot longer, hopefully more deeply.
Just a little while.
It touches on a lot of the sort of things that we talk about on the show and that I deal with in my work as a futurist. That's a job I'm embarrassed to say. But what I find particularly interesting, and it taps into a lot of my ideas in the world, which I don't believe are exactly aligned to yours. I come from a very different perspective and very different part of the world, so which gives a different as to how we think and what sort of solutions and means we've seen fail around us, right? Which is, I think, another conversation, but we can get to that. But I think the critical idea that I wanted to focus on today is this idea that we cannot buy our way out of our problems. We cannot buy our way better. I love the ideas of like, it's fine if I'm buying from Patagonia, if I'm buying from Anita Roddick, right? We'll make the world better just by buying better stuff. You can't buy your way out of an overconsumption crisis, even by buying better. And at the same time, you can't buy your way out of social problems, which is something I find really, really interesting. Like, we can't just tax more. You know, we can't just pay more taxes and then our problems will be solved, right? That doesn't solve the problem either. It's also buying our way out of a problem where it actually requires work. And this was kind of the fundamental misunderstanding of democracy as we have it. We see democracies in decline all across the world. Like, we've had like shocking statistics for democracy, not so popular anymore, certainly not trending up at a global level and not at many local levels either. And part of the reasons I think for that is that we were sold this idea that getting a vote and paying your taxes would solve your problems. You could outsource it to a state of your choosing, right? But it was very much a case of we buy a government and then we don't have to participate in citizenship. But the whole point of democracy was to break away, as you said, from a sort of sovereign state we had before, where you had a sovereign who was in charge and you were a passive recipient of government. we still kind of playing in that role, even though the whole point of governance or in democracy is that it's governance by the governed, right? So, and that requires a verb, not just a check, in the mail every tax season. And I think that that's a fundamental flaw, and I think that's a fundamental flaw on like all sides of the political spectrum, where this idea that we can't just tax our way out of problems, that doesn't solve it. Money is not going to fix this, because money was made up anyway. Money is all just bits of ideas floating around. It doesn't solve anything. What solves things is people doing things. Money is just a way to sort of allocate whose attention, whose ideas get the largest sort of mind share and the most space in the public discourse. I don't know if you agree with that, because I don't think you got too much into the we can't buy our way out of government problems perspective. But I think it's the same sort of scale. It's the same sort of
I agree. I think the way I would probably articulate it, and actually it's interesting because this is where a lot of my work is taking me since the book came out. Is the diagnosis, the way I would frame that diagnosis, that what we have today is probably what I would describe as a consumer democracy.
Yeah, you pay for then you protest if you don't get good value for your
right, but also like the only agency we have in a consumer democracy is to choose between a fixed set of options.
Yes.
We choose who to give our power to rather than how to express our power. And also the other aspect of the consumer story that shows up in this is we are encouraged to, like, framed unconsciously to make that choice on the basis of our individual self-interest. So the act of voting, which, like, at its core, you could, like, the way I like to think of these things as a sort of as something we need to evolve beyond, not necessarily a kind of a bad thing that is failing and needs to be critiqued, but something that's become outdated, right? So the idea of voting as a kind of is a sort of fairly primitive version of collective intelligence at scale, right? It's like it's the wisdom of the crowd stuff. As long as everyone is asking the same question, what's in the best, what would be the best for this society as a whole, then voting could work, because you're adding up, you're aggregating all these different perspectives on what the best possible option for society as a whole is of the options that are available. Where that falls down is two things. Firstly, where the options that get offered to us are such a tiny part of the spectrum of what might be possible and what is needed to address the challenges. So when political parties cease to actually engage with the deep challenges of our time, and we have to choose between political parties, knowing that those parties don't actually engage with the challenges. And the second place it fails is where the question that we're asking ceases to be the same question. And by that, what I mean is the voting is failing, I think, as an act of collective intelligence at the moment, partly because we're being encouraged to ask what's in your individual self-interest, and cast our vote on the basis of that logic, rather than casting our vote on the basis of what's the best for society as a whole. So that, and when you start to ask a different question, you're not actually aggregating different perspectives on one question. You're just lumping together a load of competing interests, and you can't get anything generative and collective out of that. So I think you're right. And what I would describe as a citizen democracy is one where actually we're involved in shaping what the options are. We're involved in developing the ideas. We are in our communities, like, doing the work of democracy, as you say. Like, I love there's this phrase that I've been talking about with various people: democracy is something we do, not something we have, right? Like, it's not an inarticulate object. It's not an inanimate object that you just have or don't have. It's
yeah, you do it.
I love, if you haven't seen it, I would really encourage you and your listeners and watchers to look up the work of Baratunde Thurston in the States. He has a podcast called How to Citizen, where he uses the word citizen as a verb. And I think that's the spirit of this work.
Absolutely. However, these conversations can fall into the trap of being very abstract and very theoretical. And what's great about your book is that it was really centered around a whole lot of actual tangible examples of individuals who acted as citizens and not alone created communities, loose and deep ties around them to actually get things done. So I'm not going to sort of steal your content. You spent a lot of time researching that. Maybe you can just choose a couple of the examples that illustrate what citizenship is in practice. That would be helpful.
I mean, one of my favorites has to be the work that Kennedy Adede has been doing in Kenya. So Kennedy started out in the hardest possible circumstances, really, living life as a street kid in Kibera, one of the largest slums of Nairobi. Through various ways and means, managed to scrape together enough money to buy a football, and then started charging tiny amounts of money for people to play football together, and then loaning that money out to people to start micro enterprises. They also started to clean up their own streets and sort of say, like, we can't pay to transform everything, but what we can do is look after what we've got, finding their power together, building the group and the collective agency around that work. And long story short, sort of 10 years on or so, the organization that Kennedy and the group founded is now called Shining Hope for Communities, SHOFCO. It's an organization that's credited with getting something like 2 million people, supporting something like 2 million people through the pandemic. Kennedy has even gone on to, he was invited to the World Economic Forum in Davos as a social entrepreneur, and came away saying, we don't need a World Economic Forum, we need a World Communities Forum, and deciding just to start that event. And I think, and bring together all of the people doing locally led development work around the world to sort of find their sort of meta collective agency together and talk about how these paradigms of locally led development, like transformation led from within a community, can work. And so Kennedy is, like, in a way, the ultimate hero of this work at the moment, I think. But I also, like, there's so many stories I could talk about. In Jackson, Mississippi, in America, there's a sort of astonishing organization called Cooperation Jackson that started a thing called the Jackson People's Assembly, which is holding government to account, but also initiating projects across the city. I could talk about Grimsby in the UK. I could talk about basically anywhere I go, or anywhere anyone points me to, you start to sniff at this, you start to dig, and you start to peel back the surface. And what you find is that these sorts of ways of working and being are going on everywhere. And that's why I believe that this future is so possible. It's not that it's not happening, it's that the dominant story of our time, all the media outlets and so on, are staring at what we suppose to be the centers of power, at the government offices and at the capital city. Whereas actually, when you turn your gaze sort of closer, you shift your focus, you start to see something very different building. And I think if we can lean into that, then we can construct something very different in those capital cities and so on. But while we can't see it, it's very hard to do it.
Yeah, so going through those examples, and like, I'm glad you went with the Kenya one, because that sort of backs up the question that I want to ask, because quite a lot of the examples that you have are people that have come from very tough conditions, either from impoverished backgrounds. There are a lot of examples of what happens and how community structures spring up around war, around times of crisis, around pandemics. And there is a kind of sense that, is this something, does community orientation, does citizenship arise out of kind of necessity? And as a second part to that question, what are you seeing in terms of trends versus exceptional examples? Because all the examples you have, absolutely fantastic. It's great. It's still happening. Community is not dead yet. Democracy and capitalism, as we know it, has not yet killed the collective spirit. But there's also kind of the sense, certainly in the trend work that I do and the research that we do, that community ties, community projects are not exactly trending upwards, particularly in the comfortable sort of weird world, right? And there's the sense that a whole lot of loose and deep tied community projects are essentially dying out with the older generations, that a whole lot of projects that have been run sometimes for many decades are kind of running out of volunteers. So I can speak anecdotally to like the work that my parents do in their church and their community. Quite frankly, their churches are all like growing old and dying out, right? But it's not like there's a secular alternative to sort of continue that work in secular communities. At the same time, there's lots of other projects where the volunteers get older and older every year, and we don't see that next generation stepping up. And like, I'm not saying that why should young people want to do the same thing that their parents did? Every generation reinvents the world in their own image, but that's well and good if you're not taking over the work, the community work that was being done before. That's well and good if you're coming up with an alternative, right? You don't have to do it the way it was being done. There are these great examples that you talk about, but are they sufficient? Are they as plentiful as the volunteer networks that really have held society together, held and patched it through the cracks? And I do live in a society that has an awful lot of cracks. So I can talk about both in terms of the religious institutions that fill in gaps the government is not fulfilling. And there's many religious institutions across various different religions that do support our communities hugely. You can also talk about sort of neighborhood community groups, the neighborhood watches that parole around our sort of crime-ridden suburbs, you know, they like do this on a voluntary basis. And again, how the people and the volunteers that are holding that glue together every year get older, and there does not seem to be the same appetite for social cohesion and social justice in practice. At the same time, younger people are much happier to protest, but I do question protest compared to action, right? There's a place for protest, but there's also a place for actually doing things, right? There's a place for asking and there's a place for doing. Anyway, I'm not sure if that was a helpful question, but certainly from my point of the world, which might be very different to yours, I'm seeing a thinning out of the field, not a thickening of the field of loose community ties.
It's a really interesting challenge. Like the reason why you've sort of stopped me a little bit is often I get asked the question, isn't this just something that people who are already comfortable can do? Citizening as a kind of luxury, and right, yeah. And I think your challenge is actually more powerful. Like I think you're right. Like we can learn most about and doing this work from those who often have least, and that may, as you say, be in part because there's little alternative. That said, I think the way what I see is signs that these structures and the processes are starting to form in different ways, and I think, like you hinted at this in the way you framed the question, like the old ways of doing things, the voluntary organizations, the church communities and so forth, are structured in ways, tend often to be structured in ways that feel very formal and don't feel like they actually meet the modes of organizing and acting that the next generations want to engage in, right? So the first thing you do, I heard a stat the other day that there are something like there's a non-profit for every 500,000 head of population in the US or something like that. There's like 500, no, more than that. No, maybe there's 500,000 non-profits for, I don't know, like there's some ridiculous number of formal non-profit organizations, and all of them have boards and governance meetings and
what?
And you're like, and those sorts of those modes of kind of, you have to become a volunteer and you have to, like, I think what I see from the organizations that I think are kind of taking shape and doing really interesting work at that next generation level, they're more kind of informal collectives that sort of mass together, achieve something, and then move on to the next. Like, but I do think we're seeing them. I do think we're seeing that next wave kind of taking shape. So I think of work like the rise of the platform cooperative movement that's now sort of, so people organizing online. There's a really fascinating organization called Open Collective, which is specifically designed to enable, so that as a software program, what it does is it enables people to do two things. Firstly, to run an open, transparent budget, and secondly, to receive crowdfunding. And what we're seeing through that platform in cities like Brussels or London or wherever is a lot of different informal organizations starting to spring up to do something that then evolves on from there, but begins as this sort of loose informal, but what Open Collective does is provide the critical kind of moment when they can receive funds and actually start to do something. And I think that, and then I could talk about, so in the work that's springing out of Kate Raworth's book, Donut Economics, and the Donut Economics Action Lab, providing a space for people to find ways to organize around that thesis. There's this group called Civic Square, and they've worked with an organization called Huddlecraft, who are providing the infrastructure for what are called peer-to-peer learning journeys, where people start to build something together in their own neighborhoods and then compare notes with one another as they're doing it. So I think and actually Imi Kaur, who's the lead organizer of the Civic Square project in Birmingham in the UK, she has this lovely way of articulating the challenge where she says, we're not just trying to redesign the outcomes of our societies, we're having to redesign the infrastructure of them in order to redesign those outcomes. And that work is super hard. There's an organization that she's partnered with called Dark Matter Labs, that's called Dark Matter because it's like the stuff you don't see, but that is critical to, sorry?
That was the architect that was into really weird stuff.
Yeah, that's Indy Johar. Yeah, and so one of the big projects they've been doing is like, what's the contract? What's the employment contract for someone who works in one of these organizations? Because it doesn't look like the old contract. So I think the way I would see it is, I think in part you're right. Like for those who are comfortable, I think, or relatively comfortable in this moment in time, it can be it can be easier. Like there is a large number of people for whom society is still working to some extent. And yet also I think that part of the reason we don't see these things as visibly as trends is that I don't think you can necessarily count them through some of the old metrics, like the proportion of people who say they volunteer, or the proportion of people, because they're seeing that work in a different way.
Yeah, that's a very good point there. And there's a nuance to that, but that brings me to the next point, which is talk to me about the difference between charity and citizenship. So I know you poke the effective altruists a little bit, which I'm always up for laughing at an effective altruist joke because they are very funny. And the producer on our show, who is fantastic. He's currently a PhD student in ethics, and he's utilitarian. He admits to that, which I'm always excited to sort of poke that conversation a little bit. But yeah, in general, or specifically as you want to get towards utilitarian ethics, what is the difference between citizenship and charity?
I mean, put very simply, charity is doing something for someone else, and citizenship is doing it with them. I think I mean, to your effective altruist mention, I think of effective altruism, which is this idea that you should donate as much, you should earn. I mean, oversimplifying it in ways that they would probably sort of tension at a little bit. Effective altruism, in my mind, can be summed up as like the right thing to do would be to make as much money as possible on the basis that you then give as much of it away as possible to, and further, that you should give that money away to organizations that can prove measurably their impact in the world through lives saved or whatever. Now, the problem with that is that, like, frankly, not everything can be measured in that way, and so I think of effective altruism as sort of the tagline for it should be the change you can buy, and no other change, and so the work of the like really difficult, like itchy scratchy, like hard work of community, which actually results in like ties of relationship and power and messy things like that, just doesn't doesn't get done. I always think of, I mean, it was Desmond Tutu, I think, who had the best argument against utilitarianism and effective altruism, right? So that the Peter Singer, who's the sort of famous philosopher behind, in the background of the effective altruism movement, had this thought experiment that resulted in the title of his book, The Life You Can Save, where he said, if there's a child drowning in a pond, and surely the ethical thing to do is to fish the child out. And Tutu, I think, said there comes a time when we have to pause in pulling the child out of the pond and ask why they're always in there in the first place. And I think that argument is basically the difference between charity and citizenship, right? Like, charity is pulling the child out of the pond and hand-wringing that so many children need to be pulled out of ponds. Citizenship is going, how are we going to get upstream and figure out why these people are in the pond in the first place?
Yeah, that's a very good point. My favorite example that you had in the book was this. There was using that sort of ethics. If there was a choice between a very expensive painting and a child burning in a building, it's like, leave the child, save the painting, because we can save more babies with the money we can make from the painting, which is the actual thought experiments these groups have been proven.
Right.
Yeah,
and what's so interesting in that one, I think, is that one of the things that becomes invisible is the emotional and psychological impact on that saver, right? Like, how do you, like that? And that's just blanked out. It's like, what is it to be human in this time? I love I don't know if you've come across the work of Nora Bateson, and I think she's the best exploder of these kind of thought experiments. She's like, she loves to play with. Nora talks about warm data, like the living, breathing stuff that's going on in these things. And she has this lovely thing about, that there's a version of these thought experiments, like, you're in a boat that's definitely going to sink and you have to throw someone overboard, so you like have to choose between which person you throw overboard. And she's like, hang on a minute, can we not like take turns swimming behind the boat and kicking? Or like she's just like, we just got to think differently, right? Like, these things are challenges to creativity.
Yeah, it's like the Titanic. Like, why couldn't they share the door? Like, there are alternative solutions. It's not just the drug problem. Hey, the world is a lot bigger than that track. There's a lot of other things done to figure out why the people were on the track in the first place before we had to decide who gets to die, right? Like, there's a whole lot of steps behind that, which is so critical to these conversations. But there's also this idea, still unpacking the difference between charity and citizenship.
Yeah.
It's like, again, of solutions having to come from elsewhere, to come from someone with greater resources, greater capital, greater power, as opposed to deep solutions made by communities for communities. And I think maybe there's an interesting contemporary kind of conversation going on that you have a comment on, and that's the YouTuber Mr. Beast, who's in the news at the moment for digging too many wells in Kenya, apparently, right? So of course it's a nice issue, it goes right across the political divide. Everyone can feel holier than thou, depending on what side you take. But the criticism from some NGOs has been like, oh, how do these celebrities come in and solve problems that we worked so hard for? Why do they have money and we don't? But at the same time, now more people have actual wells. So from a utilitarian perspective, it's a big win. But neither of those conversations really gets to the point as to why people in Kenya still don't have drinking water in a world where like middle-class girls are complaining about having to go into a job on a Monday. Like, this is like, we have much bigger problems underneath the surface here. And the only way we fix that is from people working together to solve the underlying problem, as you said, not just the symptom. The well is a symptom of a much deeper problem, right?
Yeah.
Moving the pattern. I don't know if you have a comment on that, but I thought that was interesting to add to this conversation, given that people are all losing their toys over a YouTube wells. And
yeah. I mean, I think so two things maybe I'll say. One is just to introduce into this the frame of and the concept of asset-based community development. I don't know if this is something you've looked at much on this show, but the idea of this is that actually, like, the work of community begins with love of place and love of community and with what's strong. And there's a lovely guy called Cormac Russell who you should maybe have on the show. I'd love to watch you grilling Cormac at some stage. But he's got a couple of lovely aphorisms. One is he says, start with what's strong, not with what's wrong, and then use what's strong to fix what's wrong. And when you do that, you create far more sustainable, far deeper, far richer solutions. And the other that he has is he says, there's a really critical difference between helping while walking forwards, and he does this sort of, for those watching, not watching, I'm sort of leaning into the camera, and he says that helping while walking forwards kind of constrains the agency and the space of the individual being helped, of the recipient, and he says there's a difference between that and helping while walking backwards, and I'm sort of leaning away from the screen, and it's this idea of like, actually there is a role for helping, but it needs to be a kind of helping that taps into and creates the space for the agency and power of the helped. Because otherwise you're actually just, and for like and then so the bridging into the second thing I was saying, the Mr. Beast stuff in particular, like I guess I'm a bit of a, and I think this might be a difference between you and me in some ways, maybe, I don't know, but I tend to take a strategy of sort of yes and in these situations where I'm like not, I'd sort of go, that's great, thanks dude, and like, how about you like connect in with these communities as well, and like start to meet some of them and understand what else is going on, and like how the world, how they might sustain those wells over time, and how you could support them to do that, and what relationships you could help them build, and what power you could help them tap into. And maybe you should meet Kennedy and see what he would really like you to do next, and like that thing of like, I'm not gonna, I think from where we are in the world right now, because we are so deep in this consumer paradigm still, even as it is falling apart, and I think we all at some level know it's falling apart, we still are in a position where we can't really see an alternative as yet. And so to just blow it up, and this is sort of an argument I have with various people who talk about like we have to blow up capitalism, we are anti-capitalist, post-capitalist, all this sort of stuff, and I'm like, you're still actually only talking about the negative, and by negative I just mean like the thing that needs to be destroyed, rather than positing something that we could build. And there's I became very kind of obsessed in the research for the book on the work of on the sort of 1960s geek tome called the Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and Thomas Kuhn's famous book, and in there, that particularly on this idea that he talks about, that the collapse of one scientific paradigm, and I'm paraphrasing, but the failure, of a scientific paradigm is not a sufficient condition for its collapse. The paraphrasing that they give is like, you can't have paradigm shift without a paradigm to shift to. The failure of a way of thinking doesn't mean we'll abandon it, because we'll just stick within it until it breaks us, if we don't have a different way of thinking to step into. And I think this is like the thing I love about talking about citizens, not consumers, as opposed to talking about something else than capitalism, is that you're two things. One, you are talking about a positive alternative, but you're also talking about these things in a way that allows us to just start the work. Like, I can't design for you, and no one can, I don't really think, a kind of the next system after capitalism. I mean, maybe the Japanese guy who's done the sort of the next version of Marx might have an argument with that, but him aside, like, there's this whole thing of like, what I'm talking about is just like, we are currently trapped in an orientation of ourselves as consumers. And as a result, what we have at a systemic level is a particularly corrosive version of capitalism. If we step in, if we sit in the identity of ourselves as consumers and just turn this way a little bit and say, no, we're going to be citizens, then if we start orienting ourselves in that way, which is a power and a choice we do have, then a few years down the line, maybe the system that will evolve and develop won't be called capitalism anymore, because it won't look like what we had before. But that's not the first consideration. It's like, I think my deepest hope for this work is that it enables people to work for systems change in a way that is doable, that is startable from anywhere. And maybe we can start to have conversations that get beyond like fighting the systems and into creating the next.
There's got to be this move between showing versus just telling about the changes that we want. And we can say this with certainty, that protests and revolutions that are based only on saying, not on showing, they fail. They might succeed in dropping ideas into popular consciousness, but they don't actually end up doing anything. And the two big examples, they would be like the Occupy Wall Street, which was massive. I happened to be in New York at a time. It was surreal.
Wow.
Coming from like Africa, right? So like, you know, it was so strange, see the contrast between like, you know, the sort of downtown CBD in New York and like, you know, the hipsters camping on the side of the road, the protests. It was very surreal. And it was big. It went on for a long time. Effectively, it changed nothing. And very similarly, it got a few books written, but certainly the systems, all the problems that like David Graeber and his co like wrote about have got worse, not better. There's been no success, actually, if you want to look at what has actually shifted in terms of the way systems and structures and the way that people think and do and consume and buy. That hasn't changed. And it's not for them not trying. But there was nothing to fall back on afterwards. You know, when the camps were packed up, they went back home and they paid rent. And very similarly, you also had the case of the Arab Spring up in North Africa, where you had the youth protesting against systems, against governance, against economic systems that just weren't working for them. And recently now, there've been a whole swath of sort of post-mortem kind of op-eds written about the absolute disillusionments of the young leaders of those movements. They had so much to say. They got the world's attention. They had their governments at their knees. But at the end of that, and now these people, now they are a bit older, their sort of years has gone by, they've had some experience in life, they've been disillusioned, they've seen their movements succeed, but also not succeed, because none of the things they fought for actually shifted. And saying that the reasons for those failures were that those that are able to sort of look back with objectivity, saying that they had no alternative. And that means that, again, sort of the old worldview wins out against the idealistic youth if they don't have an alternative. Because if you win and you're not able to govern, if you're not able to run things, if you're not able to do anything with it, you know, what have you actually achieved or won? And that's a very big difference between the sort of the protests that sort of shine lights on what we need to shift, and then the next phase, which comes from actually doing the shifting, which is much less glamorous work, right? It doesn't get you on the cover of Time magazine very quickly. Although in the case of Audrey Tang, which we'll get to into a minute, we do see some sort of glimpses there. But most of the people that you write about in your book, we just go back, they still like getting things done, right? They have a little bit of success here, but they're doing hard work. They're certainly not overnight famous. They're certainly not sort of, you know, like lauded as the game changers of the society and whatever, aside from in books like your own. It's a very different path to take, but it's like the only one that will end up actually shifting the institutions, the structures, the societies around us. As much as we like to think that you know, a global consciousness movement will kind of shift things, it doesn't work out that way. It has to start with the work. I don't know what your comment is on that, but I do want to spend a little bit of time before we close up on Taiwan, because that's like very different to the other sorts of groups we've been speaking about, and it shows a way that you could kind of tie the small at scale. But what are your thoughts on? I know you've kind of spoken to.
No. I mean, it's a great question or a great challenge, a great observation. I think it's I've been reading and researching a bit about this at the moment, and as I think more about how do we actually make this happen, right? Like that, because ultimately that becomes the challenge. Like, it's all very well to observe that, as you say, people are doing these things all over the world. When you stare closely enough, when you peel back the surface in any given city or community, you find this. It's very different for that to then become the structural, the theorist, the Bakana Institute gang, whose work I really look at, talk about as the system of influence. Like that challenge of going from an emergent system, a possible system, to becoming the system of influence is so hard and has been done relatively rarely. I mean, some of the inspiration I take to what you're saying, and just to endorse and underline and maybe put in a different context, one of the most heartrending pieces of writing I've ever read is the opening to Lawrence of Arabia's Seven Pillars of Wisdom, where he reflects on his role in World War One and on what happened after World War One. And there's this little bit of where he says, youth had won, but had not learned to keep. And when the dust settled, the old men came out and remade the world in the shape of the former one they knew.
Yeah.
And it's this agony of that, like, and Lawrence lost like this incredible intellectual brilliant, creative human ended up essentially committing suicide on a motorbike. Like and such a and then after World War II, we did shift, and people like John Maynard Keynes and others were engaged in designing a new paradigm quite consciously. And I think that contrast, like, which I think is what you're talking about as well, like we need to do the work of imagining and designing the systems and structures for this citizen paradigm, not just obsess on the work of taking apart the existing paradigm. When I look at that, like and this bridges into like your prompt to Taiwan, like the most exciting positive promise of this that I can see, and I always try and look for where is it working, so that what can we learn from that? There's this sort of spirit of appreciative inquiry, like what's the best of what is that we can learn from, rather than what's wrong that we need to fix. It's the start with what's strong stuff that sort of applied at a macro societal scale. And in Taiwan, like the work that they did, like it begins with essentially this hacker movement called GovZero that created parallel websites to government websites, all with the URLs g0v.tw, and sort of imagined what the relationship between citizen and state might be, and embodied that in these sort of fictional websites. And then what happened was that when a protest moment came, when the government tried to rush through a trade bill with mainland China that sort of threw the whole independence of the state up in the air, there was a big protest. But what the protesters were able to do was step into the modes and the tools that GovZero had prepared. And so there is a really and then the result of that combination, actually, of the hard work, as you put it, of kind of creating the next, and the cognitively very hard work of creating the next, even when you're still standing in the collapsing. It's almost the hardest bit about it is to keep believing that the work you're doing is worth doing, because like the thing that you're living in is broken and you know it, and yet you're still living in it. So to keep doing that work, but then the combination of that work, that sort of GovZero work, what Buckminster Fuller, I think, talks about when he says you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, create a new model that makes the existing obsolete. Like, that is the work. But also there is a relationship between that work and protest, because ultimately the grip of the old also has to be broken. So I think if we see those as kind of holding hands together, that's the best I've got for you right now, anyway. And that's sort of what I'm thinking a lot about, is how do we do both the work of like building and connecting and naming. Like, really a big part of the reason for writing the book and using and obsessing over this language of the word citizen is to, and now I'm working with Baratunde and this guy Eric Liu in the States, who talks about this, who has a thing called Citizen University, and Kennedy and folks in Africa who are starting to use language of citizen in their stuff as well, and like trying to piece this together and connect it up, because I think that act of naming and giving language to sort of coheres this emergence and allows it to be more than just isolated examples. It allows it to become a macro trend. That's part of the work. And then how does that meet, and how do you connect into those who are in positions of power in the existing system, and kind of gently prepare them to let go of that, or to reshape that, or something? Because one of the critical moments in the Taiwan story is the Speaker of the Parliament, when the protest moment kicked off, and it was an Occupy style protest, but in 2014, a couple of years on, the protesters occupied the Parliament, started using GovZero tools while they were in the Parliament space. But at that point, the Speaker of the Parliament, Speaker Wang Jinping, came under pressure. Not Wang Jinping, sorry, Speaker Wang came under pressure to boot the protesters out, and he didn't. Instead, he said, "This is what should be happening in this space. This is what we should have been doing as parliamentarians." And so one of the things I'm really interested in is how do we find more Speaker Wangs, or how do we develop more Speaker Wangs? How do we tap into the consciousness of those who are in positions of power and encourage them to be able to see this story, such that when these moments of fissure, the next Occupy, the next Extinction Rebellion come, those in positions of power don't revert to an instinct to crush it and turn away from it, but move to an instinct of opening up to it, meeting it, allowing it to shape society in the way that Wang did with GovZero.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, I love the Taiwan story because it ties both of all those sort of perspectives together. It's, as you said, it was a protest which was shifting stories, was shifting perspective, drawing attention to an issue, but it was backed up by action. It wasn't just a moment that was lost. It was a moment that turned into a movement. And what was interesting about it is it started off like hijacking government spaces, and then it ended up being hijacked by government, right? Because it was ready. And that's really what, when you look at history from a bit of a perspective, you understand that sort of ideas lying around are the ones that change the future, but they have to be lying around. They might not sort of materialize or turn from moment into movements in the timeline you might like, but like you mentioned, like John Maynard was hanging around for a long time before he got his opportunity to rewrite the world for better or for worse in his neoliberal image, you know, like whatever you want to sort of put in that, put that perspective there, right? You know, like these ideas are lying around and they do come to fruition when people act on them. I suppose my challenge in general would be that we have plenty of ideas. We've got plenty of good ideas lying around. We've got perhaps less willing players that were really ready to run with that ball. There are people out there that are doing it. There are examples you've spoken to, but just the evidence of the revealed preference for actual action versus discourse is revealed in the fact that our current system is still continuing on, right? Like it was supposed to fail in like 2008, it was supposed to fail during COVID, you know, like there's been many moments that we could have had pivotal change, but we lacked the sort of the people to run with the ball, and that's on us too. I mean, I'm certainly not discounting myself, but being complicit in being more passive than active there. But I suppose that's the sort of moments and the opportunity that your book is speaking to. There are some players who are running with the ball. There are ideas that are being put into practice, and they need to be connected to, right? We need more of us in the field and less of the spectator role there.
I mean, I guess your viewers, listeners are getting to an understanding of me as a kind of irrepressible optimist in some ways. Like I once introduced myself at quite a serious talk by saying, the best way to understand me is that I'm half human, half Labrador, and I think that does kind of hold. But you're just making me think, because I think you're totally right. Like we've had these moments keep coming and going. But maybe, just maybe, and this thought, I need to think about this more, but I think there is something that maybe that first moment. So think back to Lawrence of Arabia, World War I, like that World War I, we didn't do the work of designing. World War II, we did. And by the way, a little defense of my my fellow countryman Keynes. There's an astonishing thing I found in my research. He wrote a letter to his wife the day after his final big meeting with the U.S. Treasury Secretary. They'd held a dinner in Keynes's honor to celebrate the inauguration of these new structures, the World Bank, the Bretton Woods institutions, all this stuff. And he wrote to his wife and he said, "My darling, I was the only non-Keynesian there." So he saw this as the co-option of his ideas, not the
through his time. Yeah. So ideas are lying around. They get executed, not necessarily in the way the original.
Exactly. You don't necessarily get to deciding how exactly they enacted. But the point I was going with that was just this idea that like maybe what's happening right now, and I think I believe this, is that maybe that first shock of 2008 was maybe what's happening is that actually there's a sort of generational development behind that, and actually only now, 15 years on, are we starting to see the people who were woken up, came to consciousness as a result of that moment, actually coming into positions of power. And this is, if I like our generation, I think, who maybe, I don't know, you're significantly more beautiful than me, so you're probably a lot younger. But the spirit of like this moment that we have And I know, for example, one of the people I've been working with on some tools and training for politicians to help them embrace participatory democracy approaches was herself a Tunisian, an activist in the Arab Spring, who has now moved into political leadership training. The people who were in Occupy in New Zealand came together and formed an organization called Inspiral and have been churning out tools for collective decision making. The people in Taiwan who were first inspired by that moment had then built on. So maybe, just maybe, like, we're now coming into the really interesting time when we who were the sort of innocent victims of 2008 and beyond are now becoming the grown-ups who actually have their hands on the levers of power, and that I think is reason to be hopeful.
Absolutely. And sometimes it takes a funeral or two for new ideas to get hold. That's
Damn, yeah.
As academics will tell you. So we shouldn't lose hope. I'm a reluctant optimist myself. I realize that if you're not an optimist, you're going to get a very shitty future, right? You have to back the future you want, which requires actionable optimism, which is why I liked your book, because it's action orientated. It's not about the theory. It's about people who are practicing. And I think that's a great place to pause this and give you the opportunity to clear up any thoughts that you didn't have a chance to tie together, and also just tell people where they can find you, where they can find your book if they want to converse with you or work with you or hire you in your consultancy.
So I have a website, jonalexander.net, where you can find out more about the book. I am on LinkedIn most actively if you want to connect, and I will, once you enter my echo bubble on there, I'm afraid I pester you painfully, so consider yourself duly warned. And I don't think there's anything I want to tie up particularly. I guess the thing I always feel like is important to end on is like this, for me, the sort of starting point for all of this work is not necessarily hope or optimism of any kind, really, so much as it is like a belief in humanity, like and that can be hard to hold on to when some of the things that we see are happening. But the moment we start to wonder whether the moment we start to think that humans are basically bad and become cynical in that sense, is the moment there just isn't anything to build from. It's also just not true, but it's a sort of deep personal psychological choice that I think has to be the starting point of this work, to believe in yourself and in others in order to start building the world.
Yeah. Love one another. It's as simple as that. Right?
Boom.
As simple and as hard as that. But thank you so much for your time today. We'll put links to anything that you want to link to in the show notes. And again, thank you for being a star. That's right, I'm wearing red. I did that very deliberately to try and capture your attention instead of my usual black. I did that because I've got quite important and very exciting, for me at least, announcement. And that is that our new book, Rescuing Our Republic, which has been written in conjunction with my friends and colleagues at Discourse ZA, is now out and about in bookstores across South Africa and available online for anyone else that is curious about South Africa. And as I've said before, as a futurist and a trained analyst and economist, I do think that South Africa is one of the clearest bellwethers as to where the weird Western world is headed. And as such, there's something you can learn from us at the bottom of Africa. We're ahead of quite a few of the trends that you're just wrapping your heads around. Anyway, this book is based on some of our most popular and most revealing, interesting, and important conversations that we've had over the last couple of years at Discourse ZA, which is a YouTube channel you should absolutely subscribe to. It's also available as a podcast if you're interested in anything to do with politics, philosophy, and economics. But the conversations in this particular book are focused on, as the title says, rescuing our republic, or more specifically, what civil society and individuals should be thinking about and doing and starting if they are interested in investing in a future for South Africa that we actually want to be a part of. Anyway, I would love for you to read this book and to give it to someone either that you like or that you hate, because the purpose of this book is to kickstart conversations around big, interesting, ugly even, but important ideas that are worthy of debate.
So if you're planning on being bored or understimulated at a family or friend event this festive season, this is the book you need to give you the conversation starters to start a debate or a fight with those who you love or love to hate most.